My name is Owen Nathu, and I'm the president of the Board of Trustees of the Athenaeum. Like probably everything else you've attended over these past several months, we'll be virtual tonight, and I thank you for being here and for your patience. This is a very special evening, and we feel very honored to be joined tonight by Secretary Kathleen Sebelius. These are serious times, and when it comes to matters of politics, we need to have conversations with serious people. For introductions and to explain how this evening will proceed, I'd like to now pass the microphone to our host for the evening, Ken Harris. Ken is a former board member, a long-term friend of the Athenaeum, and I'm pleased to say a personal friend of mine, going back about 25 years. Ken?
Thank you, Owen, and thank you to the Salem Athenaeum for providing a forum for this really important discussion during a critical time in our nation's history. Welcome again to our audience, and I am Ken Harris. Secretary Sebelius will be joining us in a moment, and I will be asking for her thoughts on a number of subjects that seem to be on everyone's mind. During that time and during the remainder of the program, our viewers, you, may write out your own comments in the chat board. Some of those comments will be selected, and our second guest tonight, Peter Kadzis, will add his thoughts as well. To get into the chat board, you just go to the bottom of your frame there and roll your cursor over it, and you'll see the chat icon in that strip below. And click on that, and you can write your comment in the box at the bottom of the screen, and then press your return key to submit it. As we wait for Governor Sebelius, just one thought. As you can see, I have very white hair, and if you should notice any flies landing on top of the real estate up there, please text me. Thank you. And I would now like to introduce our guest, Kathleen Sebelius. Excuse me. Kathleen served as the governor of Kansas from 2003 to 2009. She was then asked by President Obama to serve in his cabinet as the Secretary of Health and Human Services, which she did from 2009 to 2014. She's one of America's foremost experts on national and global health issues, human services, and executive leadership, and is the CEO of Sebelius Resources. Secretary, it is truly a special honor to have you with us tonight.
Well, thanks so much, Ken, and thank you, Owen, for your board presidency of this amazing institution. And I want to give a shout out to my brother, Donald Gilligan, and my sister-in-law, Gina Maniscalco, because they are friends of Ken's, and that's how I'm with you all tonight.
We know your time is precious. You're in a lot of demand these days, so I'll begin with the questions. First, if Joe Biden wins and the Democrats control Congress, what would you recommend they do at the federal level to combat the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, I think Vice President Biden has laid out a pretty comprehensive program. And the good news for, I think, the American people is that he went through two pandemics during his time as vice president. He, early on in the term, dealt with the H1N1 outbreak, which was a novel strain of the flu. And we did a massive vaccination campaign, which ended up vaccinating over 100 million Americans. And later in the term, in the second term, was the Ebola outbreak, which looked very daunting for a period of time, and a series of decisions were made. So he's talked about having a national plan, which has not existed since the beginning of the pandemic, mobilizing the resources and the muscle of the federal government to do everything from supply chain to logistics, using the National Defense Act to procure personal protective equipment and the vaccine, beginning to reassure the American public that when a vaccine is issued, it will be regarded as safe and effective by the Food and Drug Administration. It won't be a political stunt. It will be led by the scientists. And then getting the American public ready for really a massive vaccination campaign, as well as re-engaging in the global health world. if we don't have a safe and equitable distribution system for developing countries, if the United States doesn't participate with the World Health Organization, with Gavi, which is the on-the-ground logistic delivery system, we will continue to have this virus circulating around the globe, and no American will be safe and secure unless everybody is safe and secure. So withdrawing from the world's discussions about not only the scientific initiative, but manufacturing and financing for developing countries is a very dangerous place for the US to be.
What are your thoughts about, as we know, the politicization of things as obvious as wearing face masks? And that hasn't exactly been championed up to date. Should Biden win, what can he do to sort of break through the resistance, perhaps, of that divide and really get everyone cooperating?
Well, again, I'm just using his words that he would put in place a national face mask mandate, that it shouldn't be pushed off to the states and then the states push it down to regional levels. What we know now is face masks work. The countries that have done very well in controlling this virus have implemented face masks. Japan is a good example. Japan has a much older population than we do in the United States, arguably people who could be more vulnerable. They've had far fewer deaths than we've had because immediately they implemented a national face mask strategy. It's become a political wedge issue in the United States. And I know I will sound overly partisan by saying this, but I don't think we've ever seen a health crisis in the United States made into a political battle the way what we're dealing with right now has become. And so it's everything from face masks to trusting a vaccine to social distancing to following the CDC guidelines on opening and closing schools and places of business.
Thank you. Again, let's say Joe Biden wins and the Democrats win the Senate. And let's say that the conservative Supreme
From your
Court,
mouth to God's ear.
the conservative Supreme Court ends the Affordable Care Act, which you, of course, were right in the middle of when it was passed. What do you see as the Democrats' best options in providing greater access to healthcare moving forward if that were to happen?
Well, I think with a Democratic president and a Democratic Congress, they could actually move very quickly to respond to the Supreme Court. Legal scholars have debated the case that's coming up before the court in terms of its breadth for a long time, suggesting that the much more appropriate response to the question of is the act unconstitutional if the mandate is unconstitutional would be to sever the provisions, to strike the mandate down and leave the framework in place. If the court chooses not to do that, to follow the Texas ruling and takes the entire law away, I think a Democratic Senate, a Democratic House, and a president could fairly quickly reinstate the provisions that were found to be constitutional by the court, follow their directions, but make sure that the 20 million people don't lose their insurance. But beyond that, that insurers can't, again, discriminate against pre-existing condition, that all the states like Massachusetts, which have expanded Medicaid coverage, don't immediately lose that financing from the federal government and have to disenroll their populations, that Medicare seniors don't lose the benefits like a wellness screening and help with prescription drug costs that's part of the Affordable Care Act. You know, Ken, the Affordable Care Act is now 10 years old. And what has happened in this case is very unusual. The United States government typically would defend the law of the land, the decade-old law that is now baked into all of our health system. Instead of that, the Trump administration has taken the very unusual position that the entire law should be struck, and there is really no suggestion about what should replace it. So I think the court is likely, even with the 6-3 majority that's just been installed, the court is likely to be pretty cautious about how much disruption they want to cause from the bench.
Aha, okay. Let's hope so.
Yes.
On another subject, a lot of people are warning that democracy itself may be at stake in this election. And in fact, each person's vote is already less than equal in some ways. The Electoral College, for example, means that the president can be elected by a minority of voters, as we've seen twice in the century. That votes for US senators are even more unequal because of the disparity in population in different states, where it finds Wyoming citizens have 67 times more Senate impact than a citizen from California. Is there a realistic path to making the structural changes required to deliver a truly fair representational democracy, or something closer to it?
Well, that's a pretty thorny question, but
In 2 minutes or less.
let's start here. I do think there are serious issues with the Electoral College. There have been for a long time. And as the world's premier democracy, to not elect our highest leader with a democratic vote does seem to be quite bizarre, that we have this convoluted system of electors that are chosen. There is a way around a constitutional amendment for the Electoral College, which is really state compacts. And right now, about 2/3 of the states needed have signed those compacts. And what they basically say is the state pledges to deliver 100% of the votes in that state to whoever wins the popular vote in that state. And if enough people do that, you would have a popularly elected president. And really, it wouldn't matter that you still have a structure called the Electoral College, they'd be irrelevant because the state compact would take over. So that's one pathway for the Electoral College. I think more disturbing than the framework of the Senate, which I don't think is likely to change, is the real effort that's gone on, for the last several decades, but is certainly ramping up, where people's right to vote is really being challenged on a regular basis, where the number of lawsuits brought to suppress votes, to put in place restrictive voter ID laws, where to throw out ballots, is heavily Republican and advanced by Republicans, and overruling state rules and laws. And we're seeing it play out real time in this election. Things like, we're in the middle, you might have noticed, of a pandemic. A lot of people don't feel safe and secure going to their polling place. We're told to stay away from gatherings. Poll workers themselves are very reluctant to be in a polling place. And yet the notion that somehow a mail-in ballot for the number of states that don't do that on a regular basis, have that as a limited population choice, that should not be counted as a regular vote, is now being upheld by the Supreme Court and overturned by courts across this country. It is very disturbing to suggest somehow that if somebody mails a ballot in and it doesn't arrive exactly on election day, that it's fraudulent, which 2 courts have now suggested, and one justice on the Supreme Court suggested that anything that isn't counted on election day could be voter fraud. Well, that's ridiculous. So we have, I think, a fundamental issue, not just the way votes are counted, but who gets to vote and whose vote is counted, that I think we really have to reckon with in this country.
I guess one of the questions that is most on people's mind right now relates to comments Trump has made, and it's been in the newspapers, it's been talked about for weeks and weeks, that suggesting, as you're describing, these attempts to make legitimate aspects of voting look illegitimate by certain parties, particularly on the Republican side. And he has indicated that, he said in so many words, that if he loses, it's because of fraud. It's because the election was illegitimate. Now, if he were to lose the popular vote and the electoral vote. Yet still refused to leave. And there have been suggestions he has certain avenues that he could try to do so, even with both of those things being true, or tried to tie it up in the courts for weeks and weeks and weeks by challenging mail-in votes and dropped-off votes and so forth. What do you think is the likely scenario that could overcome that and create an expeditious transition of power?
Well, I would say I'm a constant optimist. I'm a Democrat in Kansas, so I have to be an optimist, or I wouldn't be able to survive in my own home state. And I keep hoping, in spite of the evidence, that eventually people will actually do their jobs. So I've been waiting for a long time for the branches of government like the United States Senate to recognize that they are a check against the balance of the presidency. They are one of the equal branches of government, but so far I haven't seen that. I'm waiting for the courts to also do their job. And again, the framework of our democracy was 3 co-equal branches of government, and 2 of those 3 should be the bulwark against anybody asserting that they have unique powers and that they will be an oligarch instead of a president and leave in a peaceful manner. And I guess I find myself as an old lady, I'm struck by the fact that this is an entire 180 for me. The one institution that I have some confidence in at this point is actually the United States military. I think they had a test run in Lafayette Park when the president of the United States, under very false pretenses, cleared peaceful protesters from the park across from the White House using tear gas and pepper spray and military men and women to march across so he could have a photo opportunity in front of a church that's a block away from the White House. And what you saw immediately following that was the Army Chief of Staff immediately apologizing for having been used in that manner and pledging never to let it happen again. You had troops who said, we won't be part of this political gamesmanship. That isn't our role. We are not going to clear protesters out of the main streets in Washington. We are not going to invade Washington in the way that the president was asking them to do. So I have some confidence, if the other 2 branches fail, that the military actually will enforce our democracy. And as somebody who was in DC in the late 60s marching with the protesters against the Vietnam War, it's a little hard for me to believe that now I'm putting confidence in that branch, but I think they had a test run and found themselves to be in a position where they believe in the country more than in the person who is holding the office.
Let's hope so. Because as you mentioned, as an optimist, and the checks and balances that are supposed to occur when, especially the idea of an election for the president of the United States, which is one of the most important things that happens every 4 years in our lives. And as we saw in the year 2000, when 5 justices in the Supreme Court interrupted what would have been a messy but maybe more democratic flow of how the votes were counted in Florida. And we know how that turned out. And if anything, it seems like the Supreme Court may be more hardened against allowing things to take a natural course democratically.
Well, interestingly enough, in Florida, in 2000, first of all, there was I went back and did some reading about that multi-month episode, and the Miami-Dade County ballot count, which was being conducted by hand and was likely to be determinate one way or the other, was actually stopped by a protest that's been fondly referred to as the Brooks Brothers protest, because a organized group of young Republicans who were in blazers and khakis and loafers, but they were shouting as they took over the office where the counting was occurred. They were shouting voter fraud. And as this reporter suggested, it was the first time that that term had ever been used. I mean, this was a hand count going on under judicial orders. People were observing. I mean, there was no fraudulent anything. They were actually fulfilling the judge's orders to do the hand count. And yet voter fraud was alleged, and that has been a mantra of the Republican Party since the year 2000. So suggesting somehow that absentee ballots are voter fraud, or mail-in ballots are voter fraud, or any number of things are voter fraud has been a pretty consistent 20-year message. And just a final point about 2000, both Amy Coney Barrett and Brett Kavanaugh were lawyers as part of the Bush family in this recount effort.
Right, I recall reading that myself.
Terrifying.
It doesn't bode well. Again, changing the subject a bit, but it's an overarching concern, I think, for both the Democratic Party and the Republican Party. But I'll start with the Republicans. If Trump were to lose, what do you imagine might happen? What direction might the Republican Party go in going into future elections and in general in the way it defines itself?
Well, it's a really interesting question. There was a strong suggestion and some initial effort after the Republican loss in 2012 to then second term Barack Obama that, you know, they really had to take a very hard look at this shrinking party, the party of white men. It was getting smaller and smaller as the country got more diverse and younger. The Republican Party's base was actually receding, not growing. That you know, the Republicans had to take a hard look at their stand on immigration, at their stand on a variety of social issues, had to be more inclusive, had to be more engaging. And yet, you know, fast forward from 2012, what you saw in 2016 was somebody who won the nomination by sort of doubling down on this shrinking party and put forth all the grievances of, you know, the world is changing and we don't like it, and we don't want to give up power, we don't want to give up position, and everybody else is an enemy. It's you versus us. So I think hopefully there will be an opportunity for people who find that the party that they thought was the Republican Party no longer looks like the party, whether it's conservative views on deficit spending and budgets, which this president has clearly not done, or outrageous views on immigration, which the previous Republican president had not embraced at all. I mean, George W. Bush, coming out of Texas as a governor, was very sympathetic to the notion that we needed a reasonable immigration policy. We needed a way to incorporate people into the country. So I do think that while Donald Trump is not an anomaly, there clearly are people who support these views. I'm not sure that the Republican Party won't figure out a different path forward. Again, an optimistic view, but if they continue to double down on this strategy and if they find it a losing strategy, I think they have very few other alternatives than to change all the rules, which is what they're trying to do with the census, with gerrymandering, and with the courts repressing and suppressing the vote.
Are you concerned, though, that with the degree of the way information is processed these days by different segments of society and the siloization of information and the anger involved in Trump's base, that should he lose, is there going to be a reevaluation for his base, or are they just going to be furious and just feel like everything was as a result of fraud and conspiracies and so forth?
Well, I think it's probably going to be all of the above. I do believe that there are some Republicans who are appalled by the violent tendencies, are not racist and white supremacists, are not misogynists, are attracted to what they see as a value-based proposition for them. You know, they've made a lot of money. They're laissez-faire about government. They would like fewer regulations and lower taxes, and find a court ruling not necessarily on the social issues that we've talked about, healthcare and others, but like the court rulings on getting rid of regulations and you know, making sure that corporations are seen as people, and that, you know, that friendly view. So I think that's a portion of the population who will continue to be Republican. I think there's another group who are really dangerous and hopefully will not find safe haven for very long. I mean, I was terribly alarmed to see one of the local courts ruling recently that people can come into polling places carrying concealed weapons. The Michigan judge, I think, had said that that was not going to be allowed, and was recently overruled. Well, when you have armed militias standing outside the door of an elected governor in a state, when you have a small group of really criminals threatening to kidnap her and her family, put her on trial, and I guess kill her, and then you allow for people to come into a polling place with arms, I think you're really inciting some potential violence. And we may see that. Trump has called on his supporters to show up and watch very carefully, to do everything short. He hasn't used the word harassment, but there's nothing that hundreds of people shouting at folks would do. I was just told that that's going on in my old hometown of Cincinnati, that there are observers with bullhorns standing outside of polling places in downtown Cincinnati, lower income African-American polling places, with bullhorns shouting insults as people as they come in and out to vote. That's not, I think, how we want to conduct our democracy, but that's likely to grow. That's early voting.
No, that's terrible. I
Yeah,
haven't heard
it's
that story.
terrifying. It's terrifying.
Shifting for a moment now to the Democratic Party, and should Joe Biden lose in this case? As we know, the Democratic Party has been going in different directions in the last 8 years. A lot of movement from the more progressive wing of the party coming in with voices. They're, you know, sort of everyone's united behind one candidate because people are so, I guess, done with Trump on the Democratic side. But if Joe Biden loses, what do you see happening in the evolution of the Democratic Party?
Well, I frankly can't spend a whole lot of time thinking about Joe Biden losing, jump out the window. But I do think there's no question that even in the time that the primary of 2020 has been underway, the party has moved to consistently more progressive positions. Some of that is due to Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders and some of the other candidates moving. Some of it is due to the House elections in 2018 and moving. So I see the Democratic Party becoming increasingly progressive. It meets a reality and we had this, you know, back in the era where I was in DC, what can you get passed? What exactly? And, you know, the Senate is usually the blockade to the House. It is supposed to be the check and balance of each other. But in our situation, we had 60 Democratic senators for the first 2 years of Obama's administration, along with a majority in the House. And we could not get even what I thought were not terribly controversial things today. We couldn't get, for instance, Medicare negotiation on drugs. There were senators who were Democrats who felt that was a bridge too far. Couldn't get a public option in the Affordable Care Act because of Democratic senators. So it is always a balancing act, but I think the party is moving further and further into a progressive lane, feeling that it's really the racial inequity, income inequity continues to grow. The climate challenges that we face need to be addressed in big, bold ways. I do think just since March, since Joe Biden got more ways here on the campaign trail. So we're seeing, a progress being made toward a more progressive Democratic Party.
Owen just sent me a question he would like me to ask you, so I'm going to do that at the moment. Is there a strategy imaginable to get non-supporters of the ACA to embrace its value and need? How do we get people to not vote against their own interests? That's his question.
Well, what's interesting is after 10 years, the Affordable Care Act is actually quite popular. About 70% of Americans think it's a pretty good idea and do not want the law to go away. It took a while to get to that point, but it's now not just a majority feel it's popular, but a pretty substantial majority. So I think that with everything in America, it takes a while, and there is a lot of disinformation, a lot of skepticism. A lot of people were told they were going to lose their health plan, they were going to lose their doctor, they were going to lose their firstborn child. We didn't know what they were going to lose. And after a while, people said, well, that didn't happen. I think there's still a lot of concern about the high cost of healthcare. Many of those concerns have nothing to do with the Affordable Care Act, but it's all right. We got to address those as they go. But I think, right now, what you saw is even with a Republican, remember Donald Trump had a Republican House, a Republican Senate, and the White House. His number one priority was to repeal the Affordable Care Act, and he couldn't get that to pass with all the real estate in Washington. So I think we've seen, a swing, and that's why I am somewhat more optimistic about the ultimate court result. Is I think they are cautious about too much legislation from the bench. This is a 10-year-old law, and while they may find parts of it to be not meet a constitutional challenge, I would be really shocked if they follow the Texas judge who was alone in his opinion that the entire law should be struck down. No other court has agreed with him. And I think it would be highly shocking if the United States Supreme Court, even with this tilted majority, were to agree that you just get rid of the whole law.
Well, very, very helpful. I know that and all the questions you've addressed are really things we're all talking about and thinking about these days. Secretary Sebelius, we can't thank you enough for sharing these insights. And again, in a broader way, thank you for all you've done for the country in the various ways you've served us and the ongoing leadership that you're using, trying to advance health and well-being throughout the world. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me tonight. I look forward. I've been invited by Owen and you for a personal visit to the Athenaeum, which sounds like a magnificent cultural institution. And in this day and age, to have a library and a cultural center that is open to the public and inviting and engaging and talking about ideas in a civil manner sounds just totally terrific. So thanks for letting me participate. Good luck. And I look forward to seeing you in person before too long.
We as well. Thank you.
Thanks.
I'd like to go now to our second guest, who we are also very lucky to have tonight. He's well known to many of you for his career as a journalist. He's the former editor of the Phoenix newspaper, a senior news editor for WGBH, and the co-host of the political podcast, The Scrum. Peter has kindly agreed to join us with his take on the discussion, as well as to respond to your comments as well. Peter Kadzis. Peter, welcome.
Great to be here, Ken. If people look closely, they can see I'm coming to you from my kitchen in Jamaica Plain. They with the magnets and postcards and all that are there. Even though I'm in Boston and many of you are on the North Shore, I feel a real affinity for this audience as a member of the Boston Athenaeum, sister institution.
Right.
So I feel honored to be here. What I've done here is put together a list of, say, 10 observations that I hope will provoke questions or discussion from our audience. So let me launch in right now. Number one, Massachusetts is a bubble. While there are more Republicans on the North Shore than there are here in Boston, the Bay State's political brand is, in fact, left-leaning independent. Two, what about Governor Charlie Baker, you ask? He's certainly an updated personification of the Saltonstall, Sargent, Volpe, Brooke, Richardson, well GOP. But by the standards of a lot of the United States, Baker is a Bolshevik. An argument could be made that Massachusetts is a colony of the Lincoln Project, but not quite. Massachusetts has its own version of the Trumpian urban-rural divide. It's called Worcester County. 20 years ago, 6 of Worcester County's 60 cities and towns supported the Bush-Cheney ticket. In 2004, the number pulling the GOP lever jumped up to 12. And in 2016, 33 communities went for President Trump and Mike Pence. Now, how will this play out next Tuesday? Don't ask for any predictions. On the morning of the 2016 New Hampshire primary, I said that Donald Trump would win the Republican nomination and Hillary Clinton would be the Democratic nominee. And then I've retired from the prediction game and I'm staying on the sidelines. I will admit, however, that during the Democratic primaries, I personally liked Amy Klobuchar, although I never thought she had a snowball's chance in Florida of winning, but I found her personally very appealing. If people, want to try to read what that means for me. My advice is keep an eye on New Hampshire. Clinton won the Granite State's 4 electoral votes by less than 1% 4 years ago. Now, Biden is ahead in the polls up there right now, but 538, the famous website, has 70 scenarios under which Trump could win, and 4 of them include New Hampshire. Now, the odds are long about him taking New Hampshire, but I think it's worth keeping an eye on that state because it might, and I've got to emphasize might, just give an indication of how some other states might break. Mm-hmm. On a personal note, the most interesting race in New England is Maine Republican Senator Susan Collins' re-election bid. The race is tight, and many think that Sarah Gideon is going to win. Maine is a very quirky state, and there's no doubt that Collins is in trouble. Now, I spend a lot of time in Maine, and I've never sensed so much interest as there is in this race, at least not for the last 25 years. Now, talking about politics in public in Maine is a little bit like talking about sex in church. So bear that in mind with this anecdote. Last weekend, I was in a coffee shop in Porpoise Point, and there were 2 women in front of me, and they were talking about the very, very powerful Obama radio ad that had been running all weekend and is still running up there, urging a vote for Gideon. Now, both women admitted to each other that they had never voted for what they called the other party. One woman said she was going to take the plunge this time, and the other said she was really thinking about it. Now, to me, that's the down east version of being lewd and lascivious. There's something in the quiet air up there. And it'll just be very, very interesting. The race has continued to narrow. I mean, Collins, months ago, it looked like she was dead in the water. It's still tight. It'll just be interesting to watch and see, is that like New Hampshire, a harbinger of things to come? So, that sort of brings me to the larger question of what happens when the dust settles? And by the way, I think, as Secretary Sebelius suggested, it may be a little while before we know when the dust settles. But will either Biden or Trump be able to claim a mandate to rule? You could say that's a good question. Myself, I think mandates are overrated, especially these days. For 4 years, the nation has been roughly divided between 40% of the people who thought Trump was fine, 50% who said they wanted someone else, and roughly 10% swing. Now, I've rounded those numbers down a little bit for the red and blue sides, but the unaffiliated remains about the same. But what's remarkable is the degree to which this 50-40 split has held. In a few days, we'll begin to find out what it means. But history teaches us some uncomfortable lessons sometimes. Let's look at 2008, when Obama won and, had strong positions in the House and the Senate. In my own view, the Democrats couldn't get out of each other's way. Now let's forget for a moment about the Republicans who were just hell-bent on obstruction. We can't ignore it totally, but just for the moment, let's put this out of our mind. The Democrats passed an inadequate recovery program. Now, the reasons for that are very complicated, and I don't want to get bogged down on that. But as a result of that, they lost control of the House and the Senate. Even look at the National Health Care Plan. It's, in many ways, in retrospect, a miracle that it happened. But, it was not all peace and understanding among the Democrats. So I guess my concluding point is, so much for mandates. Even if the Democrats win, and let's say they win big, for the sake of argument. I don't know how to define big, but the Democrats have been on a roll. They did very well in the midterm elections. Let's assume they keep that momentum up. The Democrats are not a united party in the same way that the Republicans are. In many ways, it's combined of, it's almost like tribes of warring factions. What's so spooky about the Republicans, to me, is that the smaller they get, the more focused they get. And on that happy note, I'd be happy to take questions.
We have some, but thank you for that overview. I have a question here from, it's about the ACA. It's from a doctor in California who's joining us tonight.
Wow.
We're honored to have. And I know your specialty in the ACA isn't quite where Secretary Sebelius is with, but I'm sure you have your thoughts. He asked, in a Biden-Harris administration, what do you see as some of the improvements that could be made in the ACA? Let's say it doesn't go away entirely, that the court doesn't get rid of it, but you have a Democratic Senate and a Democratic president. What are some of the things that you can imagine would make it stronger and more appealing to a wider audience?
Ooh, that is way above my pay grade. But as a consumer, let me offer some ideas. If you look here in Massachusetts, you'd see the Mass Health, the state Massachusetts healthcare, once known as Romneycare, the model for what was once the ACA, that the ACA has been chopped up, works reasonably well. The only reason I throw the word reasonably in there is that cost containment is a real problem. And within 3 to 4 years, there's going to be a real threat here in Massachusetts of it just totally taking over the budget. So we have to make some nod to cost containment. And as I said before, that's above my pay grade. What isn't above my pay grade is we need to move nationally towards more transparency so that people can understand their bills when they get them. Now, this may sound certainly perhaps not to the doctor in California, but just the simple fact of being able to understand what you're being charged for would be a huge step forward nationally. I have to apologize for what is clearly an inadequate answer.
I'm wondering if one of the steps that could be taken is more of a public-private partnership between the government that wants to see more care spread around and more cost containment to make that a practical thing, and doctors and hospitals and private healthcare companies coming together and trying to cooperate to do that, or almost create a think tank around solving that problem, because it seems like it's very difficult for the government to come up with its idea and impose it on the industry. But if left to a diverse private sector, it's hard to come up with a comprehensive program that will allow more people to be affordably covered. Does that
yeah, I think in the long run, we're going to have to move away from medicine as being a for-profit industry.
Mm-hmm.
Now, that doesn't mean that doctors and hospitals shouldn't be paid for what they do. If, again, my range of reference is small, but because I cover politics, the whole administration of the pandemic here in Massachusetts, or the administration of the battle against the pandemic, which has been relatively successful. And by the way, people who don't know me, I don't think anything is relatively successful. I'm pretty much, the government messes an awful lot of stuff up. I'm very impressed with the way Governor Baker and Mayor Walsh have managed to hold public opinion on their side and work with the medical establishment to deliver the services that are needed. It's a heck of a situation then when it takes a life and death situation to bring that about. But for someone who's generally a gloomy Gus, the fact that we've been doing it for 8 months does give me hope.
I agree. It's my observation as well. I'm glad we live here and not in North Dakota at the moment.
Oh, my wife is a healthcare executive, and I have to say, not a night comes by that she doesn't walk in the door saying, oh my God, those poor people in, fill in the blank,
Right.
whatever the state is. It is not good.
We have another question here. Assuming the Biden-Harris ticket is elected again, if that is to happen, as we think it may, how soon can the US rejoin the Paris Climate Accord? And within that, how can the US increase the pace of responding to environmental needs?
Well, I'm pretty sure it can be done very quickly. I mean, let's say with a figurative stroke of a pen. I suppose someone may oppose us. I don't mean someone on the other side might oppose us joining. But I got to tell everyone that the Paris Climate Accord, it's a wonderful thing, but it's aspirational. Mm-hmm. My own view politically, I don't mean personally, is it's better to be on the inside rather than on the outside. Mm-hmm. It's less than perfect, but it exists. It's a platform to hold discussions on. And I think if Biden were elected, it would be joined pretty quickly.
Are you concerned? I mean, it seems as we look around the world and a lot of the larger and more industrial countries that are contributing a lot to global warming happen to be run by fairly conservative governments. Like I'm thinking of Great Britain and Brazil with the rainforest, you know, the lungs of the planet, and other countries as well. China seems up and down in what it says and what it does in terms of commitment, and they and India are of course huge contributors. Even if Biden and the U.S. start going in the right direction in a big way, do you think the leadership of this country alone will move other parts of the world that are sort of have just been kind of sitting on the sidelines because Trump hasn't been doing anything anyway in that arena?
No, I've never bought that. I mean, I think that the howling about Trump withdrawing from the Paris Accord was really out of proportion. Just as I said, us rejoining will be out of proportion. Don't get me wrong, we should be in. Listen, these accords are much like trade agreements. They're very technical. They're very hard to enforce. They're very aspirational. I mean, I think a fact that is lost on many of us is that all over the world, some of the most intense pressure that comes, pressure applied to alleviate climate change comes at, no pun intended, the grassroots level. Mm-hmm. I think, not to get too far afield, but Boston is going to have a big mayoral election next year. And I think we're going to find climate change being a real big issue in that municipal election. So it's not a satisfactory situation, but all over the world, it's grassroots pressure that has made some things change. In places like Russia, China, Brazil, the United States, you know, the vested interests are mighty big. But I can see behind the scene, I can sense behind the scenes, say the fossil fuel industry. They know the days of the influence they have are numbered. By the way, I think they're going to have considerable influence for 10 or 15 years. You know, I'm not saying this is going to happen 6 months, but things are changing. And anyone who has kids, as I do, I have 3 boys in their 20s, 3 young men in their 20s. Their attitude towards climate change, and my wife and I are very green. Their attitude is it's not even radical. It's just like, don't be silly. Of course we have to do things. So there's a generational aspect, and I'm not sure that'll kick in for another 10 years or so, but it will kick in.
Great.
Look, by the way, this just occurred to me. Look how quickly gay marriage became accepted nationally. One day it was the end of Western civilization. Then very quickly, it's been accepted far and wide. Yes, there are pockets of resistance and all. I draw this as an analogy. They're not the same things, but the way public opinion works, I think with green issues, I think there's going to be a really elastic snap, as there was with same-sex marriage.
Yeah, that was a quick, I mean, compared, for example, to the civil rights movement.
Yes.
It took centuries, literally, and we're still in the midst of that revolution. But you're right, in comparison, those influences are not, so don't both parties have significant fissures. I wonder if the Never Trumpers will return to the moderate wing. If Trump loses, correction, if the Trump supporters will return to the moderate side of the Republican Party.
You know, very good question. I don't think so. By the way, I'm speaking intuitively. I would have a hard time. I would have a hard time rigorously backing that up. I think many of the Never Trumpers, and I don't mean the gilded brand names of, say, the Lincoln Project,
Right.
but many of the Trumpers will become unaffiliated. You know, they join the ranks of the independent. Now, there is a small group within the Republican Party that I think really bears watching. And these are people who are who began by being pro-Trump, but within 6 months or so realized that Trump was a corrupt incompetent. And by the way, I'm using that word, that phrase was coined by Robert W. Murray, a former Washington bureau chief of the Wall Street Journal, a former editor of the American Conservative. You know, he is not by any stretch of the imagination a progressive, but he has called Trump a corrupt incompetent. This is a small, relatively small group of people who were very interested in public policy, as opposed to, you know, divvying up favors among the special interests. There's a professor at a university in Texas, in Dallas, it's a Catholic school, who has put together a conservatively based program for family policy. For example, there's a group in Massachusetts of young Republicans who are very interested in climate change. All over the United States, and a growing number in Washington, D.C., have there are center-right individuals who are increasingly concerned with what the Catholic Church would call the common good, good that transcends special interests. One of their publications is called American Affairs. You know, if you're a real nerd like me, you find it interesting reading. I don't necessarily recommend it to everyone, but it's out there. I don't think they're going to revolutionize the Republican Party, but I do think this group that's settled around American Affairs is worth watching. because they're highly intelligent and they're men and women of goodwill.
So does the Republican Party, what will call itself the Republican Party, pretty much just become that hardcore 30 to 33% that just are Trump at any cost? And will they just, has he just appealed to them in such a visceral way that even if he loses, his legacy, and who knows what he may do going on beyond the presidency in terms of getting back into media and becoming, you know, an information person that leads. Would they become the new Republican Party, him and his followers?
I'll tell you, I think the institutional Republican Party has really been through a lot of changes. The institutional Republican Party absorbed the Tea Party, and by absorbing the Tea Party, the Tea Party transformed the Republican Party. Trump transformed the Republican Party. Now, let's not forget, all right, it's worth reminding people that Trump's victory was a repudiation of the Republican establishment. Just as Bernie Sanders' very strong showing against Hillary Clinton was a repudiation of the Democratic establishment. You know, parties are made up of men and women who are addicted to action. Trump will be gone and they'll figure out something to do. I mean, one of the things that has made Trump so vexing is he's, and I mean this quite seriously, he plays by the rules of a reality TV star. And it's proven to be very, very successful. But there's a cap on how successful it will be. You know, a few minutes ago when I was going on about the 40% that's held for 4 years, if Trump loses, it's going to be because he could never expand beyond that 40%. And at the risk of injecting a high-minded note into my cynicism, if Trump fails to be reelected, I think it's going to be because he's failed in his duty as head of the nation, not head of the government, but as chief of state. You know, he's never been able to unite more than 40% of the people. What happens to the Republicans is an open question, but I don't think they're going to fracture into another party. They'll churn on. To be honest with you, I think what happens to the Democrats if Biden wins is in some ways much more interesting, because there are real fissures between what I would say is the radical left and the center. Secretary Sebelius pointed out, you know, very calmly that the Biden program, the Biden platform is much more progressive than it was 6-7 months ago. I think a real test for a President Biden is how does he deal with the illiberal left? You know, it hasn't received much attention, but there was rioting in Philadelphia last night, 24 hours ago, where looters were shooting looters. Philadelphia is the 4th largest city in the nation. Now, I hate to accuse my own profession of bias, but I think there's an unconscious decision not to give that the coverage it deserved. If Biden is president, I don't think Biden will be able to stand by and watch things like that happen. So I think whoever wins, we're in for a lot of contention.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. I agree. I have one last question here, back to Susan Collins. Will Susan Collins' calculated vote for Amy Coney Barrett change any minds of the Gideon supporters in Maine, do you think?
I don't think so. I think Susan Collins, the straw that broke the proverbial camel's back, to use an old cliche, you know, was the previous I'm blanking on his name, the previous Supreme Court vote. When Collins voted for him, I honestly believe she was voting her conscience. You know, she had 2 long conversations with
Kavanaugh, you mean?
Kavanaugh. Thank you. Sorry, a senior moment there. She had long conversations with the Bush, with former President Bush, and he convinced her that he'd be a good man. I don't know Susan Collins well. I've only met her a handful of times, but I don't believe she's the great evil person many of her opponents paint her to be. I just think that people in Maine have grown tired of her on the one hand, on the other hand, but ultimately ending up on the right.
Yeah, yeah.
Now, it's worth observing that Senator Olympia Snowe, when Snowe retired, she told me that one reason she was retiring is she was not looking forward to the pressure she would have been put under within the Republican Party to uphold her own moderate values. I think Olympia Snowe made a smart decision to retire from the Republican Party. By the way, it's worth letting our viewers know that she tipped off her friend Angus King a couple of weeks before she made that decision, so King could throw his hat in the ring as an independent before then. So it's one reason I love Maine politics, is they're small enough to get your hands around, but they're big enough to have real consequences.
Well, great. Last quick question, and I think we're going to wrap up, but I have a question. Do you think if Trump loses, he would run again in 2024?
You know what? Probably. Because if he has, if he has a TV station, that would be good for business. I
Right.
wouldn't put anything past Trump.
For branding alone.
And I mean anything.
Yeah, no, I think we've discovered.
That's, by the way, if he's still at large. Because while there's next to no chance of him being indicted federally,
That's a good question.
the lawyers out there in the audience will know that Trump's real exposure comes from state and city authorities for potential tax violations. So he's in for some interesting years if he doesn't win re-election. Very
good point. Peter, thank you so much. It certainly feels like the Wild West out there these days. And I think the wildest moments are yet to come in the next few weeks. So thank you.
And thank you for having me.
That concludes our pre-election special commentary. Thanks again to our wonderful guests, Secretary Sebelius and Peter Kadzis. And I will turn it back over to you, Owen Matthew. There we go.
Thank you, Ken, very much. Thank you, Peter, for your terrific commentary. That was a really great session. And Ken, you're to be congratulated for how you conducted that and kept us really very, very interested. Many thanks also to all of our subscribers this evening. I think we all agree that information is the backbone of an informed society. And only an informed society can have an effective democracy. Our web address is salemathenaeum.net, one word. Please look us up. We're even on Facebook. Follow us on Facebook. We'll look for you next time. Don't forget to vote if you haven't voted already. And with that, I'll say good night and thank you again.